Hello and welcome to Stretford Paddock. My name is Joe and this is an exclusive interview with Anirban Sen, who is the US M&A editor at Reuters, the person responsible for writing that article that we all read, talking about exclusivity around the Qatari bid for Manchester United. Thank you very much for coming on the show, Anirban. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Joe. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
No, absolutely. Let's just get into it then. I just want to find out what is going on, what happened, what it means for Manchester United. So last week, you wrote this article saying, and you can correct it if I'm getting the phrasing wrong, because I think a lot of people, ourselves included, were sort of maybe read it one way when it was meant a slightly different way. But I think the conclusion we've all sort of got to eventually, which is what you wrote, is that you wrote that Sheikh Jassim and the Qatari bid were discussing a way to reach exclusivity around their bid for the purchase of Manchester United. That was a week ago. First of all, what is exclusivity and why is it important in this sort of deal?
Right. So, Joe, to answer your question, exclusivity in the world of mergers and acquisitions, like, when a deal is being discussed, it's a pretty significant term. It basically means that it's to put it very simply in layman's terms, like it basically means that one party that is involved in talks to buy, let's say, a certain asset or a certain company is slightly ahead of other potential buyers who are also in the mix to buy the same company or club or asset or whatever it is. So it's the equivalent of, let's say, what you would call a preferred bidder status, So So look, I mean, as our article mentioned very clearly last week, like those were one of the terms that were being discussed between Sheikh Jassim's party and Manchester United. There are still a number of options that are on the table. In fact, from what we last heard from sources, the talks are ongoing basically between all parties. Like, it's not like Sir Jim Ratcliffe is completely out of the race. I saw that there are some sections of British media which reported that Jim Ratcliffe is starting to feel less certain about his chances, but we haven't been able to verify that from our own sourcing. So just to come back to what we reported last week, like basically one of the things that we were told is that Sheikh Jassim was negotiating a number of options, and one of them was to be granted the preferred bidder status or be given exclusivity. So when I say there are a number of options on the table, let me also play out quickly walk you through what the other options are. It is also entirely possible, which is what we reported in our article last week, that the sell side, which is Manchester United, they basically decide to do a deal with one of the two parties without having to grant them preferred bidder status or give them exclusivity. Pretty much all options are still very much on the table. Like, that was just one of the terms that was being discussed, and we decided to lead with that because at that time, what we were told is that, and that's still consistent with what we are hearing right now, is that Sheikh Jassim's chances had improved slightly after he posted his latest bid. And his bid was viewed slightly more favorably compared to Sir Jim Ratcliffe's because he was offering to buy out the club in its entirety, and wipe out all its debt, and buy out the Glazers, which was financially, if on paper, a very what's the word? Financially, from a purely financial perspective, it seemed like a very attractive offer for the Glazers to consider. So that's what we meant when we said they were negotiating exclusivity or preferred bidder status. That was one of the things that was being discussed, and it's still very much on the table. But as I also just highlighted, there are other options on the table, which means that Manchester United could choose to do a deal with Sheikh Jassim without having to grant him preferred bidder status. And like I also said, Sir Jim Ratcliffe is not out of it yet. From what we've heard, he's also still in the mix. So let's see how this plays out over the next few weeks.
So the idea of sort of preferred bidder status, or this exclusivity in the bidding, I've got a couple of questions on it. But the first one is Is that something that, in my head, it would make sense that is entirely up to the Glazers whether that is granted? Is it common that the concept of exclusivity itself is granted or sort of negotiated as a sort of subsection of the overall negotiations? Because to me, if I'm selling my bike, I decide who I'm selling it to and I decide who I'm chatting to, rather than someone coming to me saying, first of all, let me be the only one who can discuss this bike. That seems strange that the Qatari side are presenting that to the Glazers. Is that a common thing where the buyer will say, we want exclusivity?
Yeah, so just to clarify, we did not say that the Qatari side is driving these particular terms. That was one of the options that was presented, and it's entirely up to Manchester United to grant that exclusivity or preferred bidder status. Like, the power is pretty much with the sell side on these sort of terms, So just to make that clear. We're not suggesting that Sheikh Jassim is forcefully, pressurizing the Glazers to grant him exclusivity. Those are just one of the terms that are being discussed. Now it's entirely up to the Glazers to grant them preferred bidder status or not. Just to clarify that.
No, of course, that's what I want. I don't know these things, and I want your expertise and your clarification. So that's perfect. And secondly, the article mentioned as well, it said Manchester United would not be allowed to negotiate with any bidder other than Sheikh Jassim for the exclusivity period, obviously, if it was granted. Yes. It could not be learned how long this period may last. The sources cautioned that the situation remained fluid and a new bid from Ratcliffe could prevent Sheikh Jassim from securing exclusivity. So what exactly, what's the point, because that's a bit sort of, flippant, but what kind of legal binding, or not even legal, but just sort of social binding does this exclusivity period have if all it takes to break it is a slightly tweaked or slightly improved bid from Jim Ratcliffe? Is it almost a phrasing of the next step rather than, genuine exclusivity? Because if Jim Ratcliffe goes, okay, well, they're in exclusivity with Sheikh Jassim, but all I have to do is offer a slightly higher share price on the eventual buyout and I get to come back into the room, how sort of binding is this exclusivity in other cases?
Yeah. So, Joe, first of all, let me be absolutely clear. We have not suggested that Sheikh Jassim has been granted exclusivity. That was one of the terms that was being discussed. So, as of now, from what we've been told by our sources, neither party has been granted any sort of exclusivity or preferred bidder status. Secondly, to answer your question around a potentially higher bid from Jim Ratcliffe, preventing Sheikh Jassim from getting the exclusivity that he's looking to secure. So typically in the world of mergers and acquisitions, what happens is when a party is granted exclusivity, as the term suggests, it means that the sell side cannot negotiate or entertain bids from any other parties during that period of exclusivity. So what we've suggested in our reporting is that if Sir Jim Ratcliffe were to put in a bid before Sheikh Jassim formally secures the preferred bidder status or exclusivity, then things could change quickly and the Glazers could instead decide to engage more seriously with Sir Jim Ratcliffe if something like that were to happen before they secure exclusivity. So we are not saying that, let's say hypothetically, if Sheikh Jassim were to secure exclusivity and then Sir Jim Ratcliffe came in with a higher bid during that period, the exclusivity would break. That's not what we are saying, because during that period, the sell side would not be allowed to negotiate with Sir Jim Ratcliffe. So even if he were to hypothetically put in a higher bid during that time, they would not entertain that bid, because that is an exclusive period where the sell side is only negotiating with the party that they've granted exclusivity to. So just to explain that nuance, I hope that makes it clear.
Well, it does make it clear, yeah. So the bid would have to come in before that exclusivity was granted for it to change the possibility of exclusivity. This is why it's good to have you on here, because I read this thing as a person who isn't as aware of these situations as you are, and I read one thing when obviously another thing is the truth. In terms of other outlets and how this has been reported, I think this is pretty much still a Reuters. I mean, obviously the exclusive comes from the fact of you saying it first, but this is something that the exclusivity side of things, and we'll talk about more than just that, but it seems to be, sort of almost a Reuters exclusive to this day. No one else I've seen really go with this as well. Do you think that this is still the case? Do you think that this was, like you said, just one part of a bigger conversation that other people couldn't get the source on? Because obviously, Reuters is one of the biggest and most well-respected business outlets in the world. I guess this is what you guys do. But that information, it seems to be exclusive to you. Is that something that, not necessarily you're proud of, but, would you sort of stand by that and say that that is still the case despite other people not being able to kind of corroborate that information?
Yeah, absolutely. We stand by our reporting, Joe. At the time when we spoke to sources, we were very clearly, told that this was one of the options that was on the table, and we totally stand by our reporting. Typically, we don't run pieces unless we are absolutely 200% sure about our sourcing. So, we went back, we went back and forth a lot with our sources. We absolutely made sure that we had the information locked down. And once we had the green light, we decided to sort of push ahead with the story, and we still stand by our reporting. Now, in the world of mergers and acquisitions, as I was telling you, like when deals are getting negotiated in high-profile situations like this, things can often change. So what was happening last week, I don't know what's being discussed at this point right now. As you and I are talking, things can change. As we've said very clearly in our story as well, that this is just one of the options that might that is being discussed. And next week they might be discussing something else. Some other terms might be discussed. Some new things might have been introduced into the deal negotiations, which might have changed the terms that existed a week before. So, it's a very fluid situation, like we've mentioned in our article. But to this day, we stand by our reporting, because at that point, we were very clearly told by our sources. And also to answer your query around why other publications did not have the same information, I think is a question for the other reporters. But what I can say about our reporting is that we're absolutely confident about what we reported, and we stand by the story that we published last week.
Yeah, great. And just sort of further in that then, this is obviously, you were telling me before we went on air that you've worked at Reuters for a number of years now. This is what you do day in, day out. And I guess a lot of the people that we as United fans and football fans sort of follow for our usual news, talking transfers, talking behind the scenes, training, managers, these sorts of the football news, aren't as au fait and as aware of the world of mergers and acquisitions as someone like you may be. Has the reporting on this deal not necessarily surprised you, but is there anything that you see as a difference between how it's reported amongst typical sports journalists and people like yourself from the financial side of things? Do you think is there a frustration there about how it's presented, or do you think that both sides are doing a fair job? Because, like I said, some of the phrasing and the wording of exclusivity and preferred bidders, these are terms that are coming from the financial world. Do you think that it's been reported fairly across sporting and financial journalism at the moment?
Right. So, Joe, look, I can't speak for other publications, but generally speaking, like what I've seen being reported all across the financial media as well as the sporting media, I think everyone's doing their jobs, and I think it's the Manchester United is one of the most popular sort of clubs in the sporting world, like across all sports. So obviously it's generated a lot of interest, a lot of readership, a lot of coverage from publications all across, and I think everyone's doing their jobs, right? So like I said, I can't comment on other publications' coverage, but in general, from what I've seen, I think so far, if you look at all the key milestones and the developments in the talks, it's been reported fairly accurately. Like there have been maybe some things that have been off here and there, but generally speaking, the direction of the talks, who's been ahead in the race at any given point, whether it's been Sir Jim Ratcliffe or Sheikh Jassim or the kind of bids that have come in. In general, what I've seen, it's been pretty accurately and fairly reported all across. So there might be as you pointed out, slight nuance differences in the way financial press reports on Manchester United as opposed to what's regular hardened sports, seasoned sports journalists do. There might be a slight difference in the way they cover the same topic, but that doesn't lessen either side. I think the financial media obviously has a different sort of angle when it's a slightly different focus when it's covering the talks, and the sporting media also is writing for a slightly more broad audience, so their coverage reflects that, and I think that's totally fair.
Okay, great. Well, it's good to know that, there are a lot of good sources on this, and it's not necessarily the case that, the sports media have got a different angle or a slightly lesser angle. That's really good to know. So, yeah, thanks for clearing that up. In terms of the sort of the current status of this thing, because like you mentioned, this article is from last week, and like we said, it doesn't seem as though there's been anyone out there saying that it isn't true or that it isn't correct, and you've backed that up yourself, so that's great. But do you think there's been any updates on this? In that article you mentioned that the Qatari offer is currently viewed as the more favourable one than in comparison to the British Jim Ratcliffe bid. Do you see any updates, any change in the last week in terms of where things are at, or are we sort of at a bit of a stalemate at the moment? Because it felt as though we were getting to a point where the news and I don't know if you were aware of this, obviously, a lot of the British press were reporting the same day that your article came out that the 9-2 Foundation had set up at Companies House as a new business in Britain, and there was also this thing about the United stock, the share price being or the shares being halted temporarily, and I think a lot of people who weren't aware of the situation fully sort of got excited and thought this means the deal is happening, it's all happening, and then for the last week nothing has happened. Where do you see this deal at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question, Joe. So, look, I mean, I think it's not surprising that we haven't had much of an update over the last week, because I'm sure you've been following the deal talks since they started about 7 or 8 months ago. It's been moving at a very slow pace. The Glazers are also known to be very deliberate decision makers. I mean, that's what our sources have told us. They're taking their time to assess the bids from each party. And they are taking their time. So it's not surprising that we haven't had much of an update. The latest, to answer your question, in terms of what's the latest over there, from what we've heard, it's still pretty much status quo. Like all parties continue to be still in the mix. Sheikh Jassim's bid is still viewed slightly more favorably by the Glazers at this point. That's what our sources have told us. And I think the big question is whether they finally manage to get the deal over the finish line over the next few weeks or maybe months, So there's a bit of uncertainty on when exactly the deal gets signed, but we've been told that all parties are still in the mix, and Sheikh Jassim's bid still looks pretty strong on paper, but not to discount Sir Jim Ratcliffe's chances over here. There's a chance that the Glazers might entertain another 11th hour sort of bidding process, where both bidders again sort of raise the stakes and raise their bids, and that might change the equation again. But from what we've been told, the talks are still ongoing, and Sheikh Jassim still continues to be it's, as the BBC podcast mentioned earlier this week, it's like we're heading towards the end game, and it's like 3-2 right now in favor of Sheikh Jassim. You could say very marginally ahead. So that's what we've also picked up from our sources.
Very good, very exciting stuff indeed. Right, thank you so much for coming on, Anirban. Thank you for sharing your financial knowledge with us. That was Anirban Sen, the US Mergers and Acquisitions editor over at Reuters. Make sure you hit subscribe to Stretford Paddock if you haven't already. This has been a one-on-one interview. We'll see you in a bit.